In March 1977, a 6-year-old girl turned away from a familiar path on a hillside in rural Ireland and never reached home. It was mid-afternoon near the Donegal-Fermanagh border. Mary Boyle had been walking back toward her grandparents' farm, less than 200 yards away, a journey that should have taken only a few minutes. What disappeared in that narrow window of time would leave a family divided, a community unsettled, and a question that has refused to fade for nearly half a century. Cashelard sat quietly on the edge of the afternoon, its fields rising and falling in uneven folds of grass and peat, broken only by stone walls and the dark seams of bog water that collected in shallow pools. The air carried the damp, earthy smell of wet ground, mixed with the faint smoke of turf fires drifting from distant chimneys. It was not an isolated place in the way outsiders imagined. Families lived close by, farms bordered one another, but it was open enough that children moved freely, watched more by habit than by fear. That Friday had begun as nothing more than a family visit. The Boyle family had traveled from Cashelard in the Rosses earlier that day, making the familiar journey to Cashelard to see Mary's maternal grandparents. These visits were routine, stitched into the rhythm of family life. Children spilled out into the yard. Adults moved between kitchen and doorway, exchanging updates, gossip, small complaints about weather and work. There was no sense of occasion, no disruption to routine. Mary stayed close to her siblings and cousins, her movements light, her attention shifting easily from one game to the next. At 6 years old, she was still at the age where play did not require structure, only space. She wore a lilac hand-knitted jumper that had been pulled down over her hands once or twice already, brown jeans smudged faintly at the knees, black boots damp from the ground beneath them. A packet of crisps crinkled softly in her grasp as she ate, pausing between bites to listen, to watch, to follow. Her twin sister, Anne, stayed nearby, their proximity instinctive rather than deliberate. They had spent their lives mirrored together, shared birthdays, shared rooms, shared attention. Even now, they drifted in and out of each other's orbit without thinking about it. Mary laughed when someone called her name, then ran off again, the sound of her boots dull against the wet grass. The adults kept an eye on them in the casual way that came naturally in places like this. Cashelard was familiar ground. The land belonged to people they knew. The paths between farms were walked daily. There were no roads nearby that carried fast traffic. No reason to imagine danger pressing in from beyond the hills. Later in the afternoon, Mary's uncle, Jerry Gallagher, lifted a ladder from the side of the house and rested it against his shoulder. He had borrowed it earlier and planned to return it to the Macaulay farm across the hillside. It was a small task, barely worth mentioning. The farm sat roughly 400 yards away, visible from parts of the yard if you knew where to look. Mary noticed the movement immediately. She followed him without asking, falling into step behind him as he set off. No one called her back. No one stopped to reconsider. It was ordinary for children to trail after adults, especially when the distance was short and the destination familiar. The ground underfoot grew more uneven as they moved away from the house, the grass thinning in places where water had settled. They reached a low-lying patch where the land dipped slightly, collecting rainwater into a shallow pool. The surface reflected the pale sky above, broken only by reeds and clumps of darker vegetation. The air felt cooler there, heavier with moisture. Mary slowed, her boots pressing into softer ground. She stopped. Whether she decided on her own or responded to a brief instruction, she turned back. The path behind her led directly home, a gentle rise over ground she had crossed countless times. From that point, the distance to her grandparents' house was less than 200 yards. A walk of 3, maybe 5 minutes. Jerry continued on. He adjusted the ladder against his shoulder and made his way toward the Macaulay farm, unaware of any reason to hurry. When he arrived, he set the ladder down and spoke with the people there, the conversation stretching naturally, unmeasured. Time passed without notice. There was nothing to mark it as important. Back near the house, the afternoon carried on. Children's voices drifted in and out of earshot. The wind moved gently across the hills. Inside, adults talked. Cups were filled and set down. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. No one stood at the door counting minutes. No one watched the path Mary had taken. At around 3:40, the time Mary should have arrived, nothing registered as wrong. A few minutes more passed. Still nothing. The expectation of her return lingered without urgency, unexamined. It was only later, when Jerry came back and noticed the absence, that the rhythm broke. He asked where Mary was. The question landed awkwardly, interrupting conversation, pulling attention inward. Someone looked toward the yard. Someone else glanced down the slope of land leading away from the house. Her name was called once, then again, voices carrying easily across the open ground. No answer came back. The air felt suddenly different, heavier, as if sound itself had been absorbed by the land. Anne stood still, listening, the half-eaten packet of crisps from earlier still vivid in her mind. Adults began moving with more purpose now, scanning paths, peering into dips in the ground, calling louder. Minutes slipped by, counted this time. Mary should have been there. The distance was too short, the path too familiar. There was no reason for delay that made sense. As the search widened across the hillside, one thought pressed quietly into the space where certainty had been. Mary had turned back alone, and somewhere between that shallow pool of water and the safety of the house, something had gone wrong. The ground changed texture as Mary moved away from the pool. Behind her, the soil was soft and dark, holding water just beneath the surface. Ahead, the path rose gently, grass thinning where boots and tractor tires had pressed it flat over time. She adjusted her grip on the empty, crisp packet, the plastic crackling once before going quiet again. The sound seemed loud in the open air, then vanished into the wind. She walked alone. The house was visible from certain angles, its outline breaking the horizon when she reached higher ground. From where she stood, it did not feel far. The distance felt manageable, familiar, a place she had crossed before without thinking. Somewhere beyond the rise, voices continued at the Macaulay farm. Jerry Gallagher leaned the ladder against a wall and wiped his hands against his trousers. He exchanged a few words, nodded, listened. The conversation drifted, unhurried, the way rural conversations often did when there was nothing pressing to interrupt them. Time moved forward without ceremony. At the Boyle grandparents' house, activity continued at its own pace. A kettle was lifted, then set down again. Someone stepped outside briefly, scanning the yard without searching for anything in particular. Children's voices faded as they moved farther off, then returned, sharp with laughter. Mary did not appear. The path she had taken curved slightly as it descended, cutting through a shallow dip in the land before rising again toward the house. From certain points, the surrounding hills limited visibility, creating pockets where sound carried poorly and movement disappeared from view. These were not hidden places, just natural breaks in the terrain, ordinary features no one had ever thought to question. Somewhere along that stretch, Mary stopped being seen. The absence went unnoticed at first. It took shape slowly, a subtle mismatch between expectation and reality. When the moment finally came, it was not dramatic. It was a question spoken aloud without alarm. "Where's Mary?" The words shifted the air immediately. Someone answered without certainty. "She was with Jerry." 2-4. Another voice followed. "Didn't she turn back?" Heads turned. Eyes followed the line of land leading away from the house. The yard, moments ago filled with movement, stilled as attention focused outward. Anne stood near the doorway, her body angled toward the slope, listening. She did not move right away. She waited for the familiar sound of boots, for the shape of her sister to emerge where she always did. Nothing broke the line of grass. A few names were called, voices light at first, testing the space. When no response came back, the calls grew louder, sharper. Adults stepped off the path, scanning the ground, peering into dips and behind low rises. Minutes passed, counted now. Someone walked down toward the pool. Someone else moved uphill, checking the path Mary should have taken. The land offered no explanation, no disturbed ground, no dropped clothing, no sign that anyone had passed through recently at all. Jerry returned from the Macaulay farm and saw the cluster of people moving with intent. He set the ladder down where he stood and quickened his pace. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice carrying. Mary's name was repeated back to him. The words landed with weight. "She turned back," he said immediately, pointing. "She went home." The certainty in his voice faded as he reached the edge of the pool and looked around. The ground there showed no disturbance beyond what had already been there. Water lay still, reeds bent slightly in the breeze. He scanned the hillside. She should have been here already. That was when the urgency sharpened. Search patterns broke apart and reformed with purpose now. Adults spread out farther, calling her name again and again, listening between calls for any sound that might answer. The wind carried nothing back but the rustle of grass and the distant bleating of livestock. As time stretched on, someone ran to the nearest phone. The call to the Garda station was placed at 6:30 that evening. By then, daylight had begun to thin, shadows lengthening across the hills. The damp smell of peat deepened as the air cooled. What had been an ordinary landscape hours earlier now felt vast and indifferent. Gardaí arrived quickly. They walked the ground Mary had been expected to cross, moving carefully, deliberately, as if the land itself might offer an explanation if handled correctly. Questions followed, precise and repetitive. What time did she leave? Where exactly did she turn back? Who saw her last? Answers came, overlapping at first, then settling into a rough sequence. At 15:30, Mary left the house with Jerry. At 15:35, she turned back at the pool. By 15:40, she should have arrived. By 1600, concern had set in. The 30-minute window closed in around them. Lights were brought out as dusk fell. Torches cut narrow beams across grass and bog, reflecting sharply off standing water. The search widened, moving outward from the path Mary should have taken. Boots sank into soft ground. Hands reached down, probing reeds and shallow pools. Nothing surfaced. By nightfall, the scale of the operation expanded. Gardaí coordinated with local volunteers. Word spread quickly through nearby farms and villages. Men arrived in work coats and boots, women wrapped in scarves, each taking a section of land to cover. The Irish army was notified. More lights appeared, bobbing across the hills like distant stars. The air filled with sound, voices calling, radios crackling, instructions repeated. But the center of the search remained empty. Inside the house, Anne sat close to her mother, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She stared at the doorway, as if expecting Mary to appear at any moment, muddy and sheepish, an explanation ready. The image refused to fade, even as hours passed without it becoming real. She wouldn't go off like that, Anne said quietly, her voice thin but certain. Her mother nodded once, not trusting herself to speak. Outside, the land yielded nothing. Bogs were probed with rods. Water was checked again and again. Each methodical action ended the same way, with silence. As midnight approached, exhaustion began to show. Movements slowed. Voices grew hoarse. But no one stopped. No one suggested leaving the ground unchecked. The possibility that Mary had wandered off, fallen, or become stuck somewhere unseen still hung in the air, unconfirmed but unavoidable. Dawn broke over Cashelard without resolution. The light revealed what the darkness had hidden and what it had not. The hills looked the same. The ground showed no new sign. The paths remained undisturbed. Mary Boyle had vanished within a landscape that should have given her back. And with each passing hour, the question grew heavier, more difficult to contain. How could a child disappear from here? Morning arrived over Cashelard without relief. A pale light crept across the hills, revealing the same uneven ground, the same shallow pools of water, the same paths that had been walked again and again through the night. Dew clung to grass and reeds. The air smelled of damp earth and peat, heavier now after hours of bodies moving across it. For those who had searched through the darkness, the daylight did not clarify anything. It only confirmed what had already become impossible to ignore. Mary was not there. The Gardaí regrouped early. Maps were unfolded on the bonnet of a car, their edges fluttering slightly in the breeze. Sections of land were marked off, reassigned, searched again. Instructions were given carefully, methodically. No one raised their voice. No one rushed. This was no longer a frantic sweep driven by panic. It was an operation. Word spread quickly beyond Cashelard. Volunteers arrived in larger numbers as the day went on, some traveling from neighboring towns, others coming from farther away after hearing radio reports. Farmers left their work. Shopkeepers closed early. People who had never met the Boyle family before took up torches and rods, joining lines that moved slowly across bogland, probing the ground ahead of each step. The Irish army was called in. Soldiers moved through the landscape with practiced coordination, their boots sinking into peat as they advanced. They carried long probes, pressing them down into the bogs at regular intervals, feeling for resistance beneath the surface. Each time the rod came back clean, it was wiped and pushed down again. Lakes and larger pools were examined next. Water was drained where possible, channels cut to lower levels inch by inch. The process was slow and physically punishing. Cold water numbed hands. Mud clung stubbornly to clothing. Still, the work continued. Nothing emerged. By the second day, the question of accident versus intervention began to take shape, not as a conclusion, but as a working framework. The landscape itself demanded consideration. Peat bogs were known to be dangerous. Stories circulated locally of animals swallowed whole, of objects lost beneath the surface and never recovered. The possibility that Mary had slipped, fallen, and been concealed by the ground was discussed openly among searchers. Inside the house, Anne listened as these conversations reached her in fragments. She shook her head each time. Mary had been eating crisps when she turned back. Anne remembered the sound of the packet clearly, the way the plastic had caught the light. She repeated this detail again and again, not out of insistence, but because it felt important. If she fell, Anne said once, her voice steady despite the dark circles beneath her eyes, the packet would be there. It wouldn't disappear. Investigators noted the comment. At the time, it did not feel like evidence, just the observation of a grieving child. But as days passed and nothing surfaced, the absence of even the smallest object began to matter. Forensic limitations shaped every decision. In 1977, there were no tools to test soil composition in detail, no way to map underground shifts, no DNA to trace. The work relied on eyesight, touch, and persistence. Rods were pushed down. Hands reached into water. Volunteers scanned for color, for fabric, for anything that did not belong to the land itself. The search expanded outward, then outward again. Every path Mary could have taken was walked repeatedly. Fences were checked, ditches examined, outbuildings searched with permission from neighboring farms. Nothing suggested she had wandered farther than expected. Nothing suggested she had been delayed. By the end of the first 48 hours, exhaustion set in. Searchers slowed. Some sat briefly on stones or fence posts, rubbing their hands together for warmth before standing again. Gardaí rotated shifts, faces drawn, voices low. There was no formal declaration, but the urgency began to change shape. This was no longer about finding a lost child. It was about understanding how she had vanished. Attention turned to timing. Mary had been last seen at approximately 15:35. By 15:40, she should have been home. At 1600, concern had been voiced. That left a window of roughly 30 minutes, possibly less, in which something had occurred. The landscape was rural, but it was not empty. People lived nearby. Farms bordered one another. Someone, in theory, should have seen something. Gardaí began door-to-door inquiries. They asked the same questions repeatedly, patiently. Who had been outside that afternoon? Who had heard anything unusual? Had any unfamiliar vehicles been seen? Had anyone noticed movement where it did not belong? Most answers were simple and unhelpful. No, nothing out of the ordinary. Just another afternoon. As the investigation continued, a broader context pressed in quietly but persistently. The Donegal-Fermanagh border was not a neutral space in 1977. Resources were stretched thin by the ongoing tensions of the Troubles. Garda attention was often pulled toward security concerns, border activity, and paramilitary movement. This disappearance, though devastating, existed within a system already under strain. Still, officially, the case remained a priority. Files were opened, statements recorded, timelines refined. Gardaí returned to the pool where Mary had turned back, examining it again under daylight. They noted the stability of the edges, the shallow depth, the lack of disturbance. It did not look like a place that could take a child without leaving a sign. As days turned into weeks, the search continued in waves. New volunteers arrived. Others drifted away, returning to work, to obligations that could not be postponed indefinitely. The army withdrew once their assigned role concluded. Gardaí remained. The ground gave nothing. Gradually, the tone of the investigation shifted. What had begun as a search for a missing child took on the weight of something more troubling. Theories circulated quietly among officers. If Mary had not fallen, if she had not wandered, then someone else must have been involved. No one said this publicly at first. The family felt the change anyway. Anne noticed it in the questions asked, in the way Gardaí returned to the same points, the same details, pressing gently but persistently. She watched her parents navigate conversations that felt increasingly uncomfortable, increasingly careful. Inside the family, tension began to build. Anne held tightly to her certainty that Mary had not simply disappeared into the land. Her mother, Anne Boyle, resisted that conclusion. The idea that Mary might still be alive, lost, taken somewhere unknown, felt easier to carry than the alternative. These differences did not erupt immediately. They settled into silence, into glances that lingered too long, into conversations that ended early. Outside, the community watched. Support remained strong, but questions began to circulate alongside sympathy. How could this have happened here? How could no one have seen anything? The longer the case remained unresolved, the more those questions turned inward. By the time the initial search phase formally ended, Cashelard had been transformed. The hills bore the marks of countless footsteps. Bogs showed the scars of probing. The land had been opened, examined, and closed again, without yielding Mary Boyle. What remained was a case file full of effort and empty of answers. And beneath that, a growing, unspoken awareness. Whatever had happened in those 30 minutes had left no room for accident alone to explain it. Time did not move cleanly after the search scaled down. It stretched, warped, and settled unevenly over Cashelard, leaving some moments sharp and others blurred beyond recognition. The fields grew back over disturbed ground. Reeds straightened where they had been bent and broken. What had looked temporary during the first weeks, the churned bogs, the trampled paths, slowly absorbed themselves back into the landscape. But inside the Boyle family, nothing reset. The days after the initial search were filled with small, exhausting tasks. Gardaí returned for follow-up questions, asking for clarifications, rechecking timelines, requesting the same details in slightly different order. Family members learned to answer without emotion, to repeat facts without attaching hope or fear to them. The routine itself became numbing. As weeks passed, the investigation entered a quieter phase. Files remained open, but urgency gave way to process. Statements were reviewed, possibilities categorized, theories tested and set aside. Without physical evidence, progress depended on inference, and inference without confirmation had limits. In the community, support remained visible but altered. Meals stopped arriving unannounced. Neighbors returned to their own routines. Sympathy did not vanish, but it grew less vocal, less constant. Conversations shifted away from Mary, unless prompted. People lowered their voices when her name came up, as if speaking it too freely might disturb something fragile. For Anne Doherty, time took on a different texture. As Mary's twin, she experienced absence not as distance, but as distortion. Every birthday arrived doubled and incomplete. Every memory surfaced with a missing half. She replayed the afternoon again and again, not as speculation, but as sequence. Who stood where? Who moved when? What Mary had been wearing? What she had been holding? The crisp packet stayed fixed in her mind. She returned to it often, not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary, lightweight, disposable, something that should have remained behind if Mary had fallen or become trapped naturally. The fact that it never surfaced hardened Anne's thinking. It did not feel like imagination. It felt like logic. Quietly, she began to believe that Mary had not been lost to the land. Within the family, that belief was not shared. Anne Boyle, Mary's mother, resisted conclusions that felt final. She clung to uncertainty as a form of hope. As long as nothing was proven, nothing had to be accepted. The idea that Mary might still be alive, somewhere unknown, beyond reach but not beyond existence, offered a fragile kind of endurance. The difference between these positions did not erupt immediately. It accumulated slowly, expressed in pauses, in avoided conversations, in moments where one person's certainty felt like another's betrayal. What began as grief gradually fractured into opposing needs. As the years passed, new theories surfaced. One involved an external threat, a passing predator, someone moving through the region unnoticed. The name Robert Black entered the conversation later, tied to his work as a van driver and his known presence in Donegal during the 1970s. Witnesses claimed to have seen his vehicle near a pub in Donegal. One person reported hearing cries from the back of a van. For a time, this theory gained traction. It offered distance. It placed responsibility outside the community, outside the family. Investigators examined Black's movements carefully, comparing employment records and timelines. In the end, the hours did not align. He could not be placed in Cashelard during the critical window. The theory faded, leaving behind a sense that attention had drifted away from something closer. Another account emerged from a fisherman who reported seeing a suspicious red car in the area. Details were vague. The vehicle was never identified. Without corroboration, the lead stalled. Each abandoned theory left residue behind. Not answers, but frustration. Anne Doherty's belief hardened further. She became convinced that Mary had been harmed by someone known to the family. Someone close enough to move without drawing attention. Someone with reason to keep a secret buried. She spoke publicly about this belief years later, naming no one outright but making the implication unmistakable. Her mother rejected it completely. The rift between them widened, transforming grief into conflict. Anne Boyle publicly admonished her daughter's campaign, calling the accusations reckless and unnecessary. She did not want an inquest. She did not want conclusions drawn without proof. The idea of a formal declaration of death felt unbearable. The family, once unified by loss, now carried it separately. Beyond the household, the case settled into the category of unresolved. It was not forgotten, but it was no longer active in the way new cases were. Garda resources shifted. Files were reviewed periodically, then returned to storage. The phrase, ongoing investigation, remained accurate but hollow. Years passed. Media attention resurfaced intermittently, often triggered by anniversaries or renewed appeals from campaigners. In 2008, RTA aired a documentary examining the disappearance. It revisited the facts, the terrain, the unanswered questions. Viewers watched, discussed, moved on. In 2011, Margot O'Donnell stepped forward more forcefully. As a family relation and a well-known figure in Irish country music, she brought visibility the case had not had in years. She funded private searches of the Donegal Hills, hiring specialists to re-examine areas that had been probed decades earlier. She spoke openly about her belief that the truth had been suppressed. Her song, The Missing Mary Boyle, served as both memorial and protest. It carried Mary's name into spaces where case files could not reach. Still, no evidence surfaced. Time continued to narrow the field of possibility. Witnesses aged, memories softened. People who had been present in 1977 grew older, less certain of what they had seen or heard. The absence of resolution began to feel permanent, a fixed feature of Irish public life. For Anne Doherty, this permanence became unbearable. She intensified her efforts, speaking to journalists, participating in documentaries, refusing to let the case recede into quiet archival status. Her language sharpened. Her frustration became visible. She described not just the loss of her sister, but the feeling of being blocked by institutions, by politics, by forces she could not confront directly. This was not just about Mary anymore. It was about silence. By the time the case entered its fourth decade, the search for Mary Boyle had become something else entirely. It was no longer only a search for a child. It was a confrontation with the limits of justice, the weight of influence, and the cost of unanswered questions on those left behind. And just when it seemed the silence would hold forever, voices from inside the system began to break it. The first cracks did not appear in courtrooms or official statements. They surfaced in memory. Decades after the disappearance, men who had worn Garda uniforms in 1977 began to speak, not because they suddenly discovered new evidence, but because time had loosened something that fear and hierarchy had once held firmly in place. Retirement removed obligation. Distance softened consequence. What remained was conscience. Martin Collins had been a Garda sergeant stationed in Ballyshannon at the time. When he spoke publicly years later, His voice carried the restraint of someone accustomed to choosing words carefully. He did not describe chaos or incompetence. He described something colder, a phone call. It came into the station shortly after Mary disappeared. According to Collins, the call did not ask for updates or offer assistance. It carried an instruction. A particular family, he said, was not to be treated as suspects. They were not to be pursued with the same rigor applied in a typical investigation involving a missing child. The words landed heavily when they were finally spoken aloud. Collins did not name the caller. He did not need to. In rural Ireland of the 1970s, the implication carried its own weight. Political influence was not abstract. It was personal. It moved through favors, loyalties, expectations understood without being written down. Another retired officer, Detective Sergeant Aidan Murray, added his own account. He described an interview conducted years earlier with a man considered a suspect. The questioning was tense. The man became visibly distressed. His breathing changed. His composure fractured. Murray pressed forward, sensing that something meaningful might surface if the pressure held. That was when a senior inspector intervened. According to Murray, the instruction was brief and unmistakable. Ease off. The interview ended. Momentum vanished. The moment passed. When these testimonies emerged, they reframed the silence that had defined the case for decades. The absence of charges no longer felt like a simple failure of evidence. It began to resemble restraint imposed from above. Public attention reignited. In 2016, journalist Gemma O'Doherty released her documentary Mary Boyle, The Untold Story online, bypassing traditional broadcast channels entirely. The film gave space to the retired Garda testimonies and, for the first time, allowed Ann Doherty to articulate her accusations without filtration or softening. The response was immediate. View counts climbed rapidly. Viewers shared the documentary across social platforms. Conversations that had once been confined to Donegal spilled into national discourse. Protest marches followed, first in Ballyshannon, then in Dublin. People carried signs bearing Mary's name, demanding an inquest, demanding transparency. The documentary did not present new physical evidence. It did something else. It challenged the integrity of the process itself. Within that challenge, one name began to surface repeatedly in public discussion: Sean McAniff. McAniff was a prominent Fianna Fáil politician and hotelier, a powerful figure in the region at the time of Mary's disappearance. Though not explicitly named in the documentary, the implications were widely understood. McAniff denied any involvement emphatically. When confronted by singer Margot O'Donnell, he dismissed her claims as false. When journalist Gemma O'Doherty persisted, McAniff filed a defamation lawsuit seeking €75,000 in damages. The legal action sent a clear message. Even decades later, the case remained dangerous territory. McAniff's death in 2017 did not end the dispute. Irish courts allowed his estate to continue the defamation case, underscoring just how legally sensitive the allegations remained. For campaigners, the continuation felt symbolic, a reminder that influence extended beyond the lifespan of individuals. While public debate intensified, Gardaí took action of their own. In October 2014, officers arrested a local man, Brian McMahon, in connection with Mary's disappearance. The news spread quickly, reigniting hope that the case might finally move forward in a tangible way. McMahon was questioned extensively, then released without charge the following day. He spoke to the media afterward, his tone controlled but unmistakably angry. He claimed he had been targeted not because of evidence, but because the investigation needed a result. According to McMahon, officers knew he was not involved, yet pursued him anyway, determined to extract a confession that would satisfy public pressure and close the longest unresolved child disappearance in the state. The arrest produced no charges, no follow-up. Another door closed. 2 years later, in 2016, the Garda Serious Crime Review Team, the Cold Case Unit, announced a new excavation at Cashelard. Modern forensic archaeology was brought in. Ground-penetrating techniques were used. The operation was highly visible, accompanied by press coverage and official statements emphasizing renewed commitment. For Ann Doherty, the announcement carried cautious hope. She stood near the site, watching as machinery moved earth that had remained undisturbed for decades. The smell of freshly turned soil filled the air. The hills that had once been searched by hand were opened again, this time with technology that had not existed when Mary vanished. Days passed, then weeks. The excavation ended without discovery. No remains, no clothing, no objects linked to Mary. Critics described the operation as performative, a gesture designed to demonstrate action rather than uncover truth. Anne Doherty echoed that sentiment publicly, accusing authorities of checking a box instead of confronting the deeper issues surrounding the case. Despite everything, the investigation remained officially open. In 2018, supporters delivered a petition bearing more than 10,000 signatures to the Donegal coroner, Dr. Dennis Macaulay. The demand was clear: a formal inquest. Such a proceeding would allow witnesses to be subpoenaed and questioned under oath, bypassing the informal constraints that had long shaped the case. Authorities resisted. They cited the ongoing nature of the criminal investigation. They emphasized legal caution. Under Irish law, the Attorney General held the power to order an inquest even without a body. But such action was rare, politically sensitive, and fraught with precedent. As years passed, time claimed more voices. In 2023, Jerry Gallagher, the last person known to have seen Mary alive, died. With his death, the final living link to the critical 30 minutes disappeared. The window through which direct testimony might emerge narrowed further. What remained was structure, allegations of political interference, testimony from retired officers, a family divided by belief and grief, a case that many in Ireland considered known, yet legally untouched. The truth, whatever its precise form, no longer felt entirely absent. It felt contained, and the question shifted once more, not from what happened to Mary Boyle, but from who knew and who had ensured that knowing would never become proof. By the time the case reached its fourth decade, it no longer behaved like an investigation. It functioned more like a boundary, something people worked around rather than through. Officially, Mary Boyle's disappearance remained live. The phrase appeared in statements, in replies to parliamentary questions, in carefully worded responses from the Gardaí. In practice, it meant little more than this. The file was not closed, but nothing decisive moved forward. No charges, no inquest, no public reckoning. The state held its position. Authorities continued to argue that an inquest would be inappropriate while a criminal investigation was ongoing. It was a position that appeared circular to those watching from the outside. The investigation could not advance without testimony under oath, yet testimony under oath was withheld because the investigation was said to be active. The mechanism designed to uncover truth remained permanently just out of reach. For Anne Doherty, this stalemate became the defining reality of her adult life. She did not measure time in years anymore, but in efforts. Interviews given, letters written, meetings attended, campaigns organized. The phrase, "Justice for Mary Boyle," was not a slogan to her. It was a description of unfinished business. She spoke with clarity, not anger, describing the psychological weight of living without resolution, of carrying what she called ambiguous loss, a sister who was neither alive nor confirmed dead, a grief that never settled into one shape. Her certainty came at a cost. The relationship with her mother remained fractured. Anne Boyle did not share her daughter's conclusions, and she did not support the push for an inquest. To her, public accusations threatened dignity, invited speculation, and closed doors that uncertainty still left open. She preferred silence to certainty, absence to finality. They lived with the same loss, but not in the same way. Beyond the family, Mary Boyle's name took on symbolic weight. Journalists began to refer to her as Ireland's Madeleine McCann, a comparison that captured public attention but never fully fit. The McCann case drew global resources and international scrutiny. The Boyle case drew something different, an internal reckoning with power, influence, and the limits of accountability in a small state. What made Mary's case distinct was not only that a child vanished, but that so many people came to believe the truth was already known, merely unspoken. In rural Ireland, knowledge did not always travel through official channels. It moved through glances, hesitations, things left unsaid. The allegations of political clientelism, of favors exchanged for silence, of investigations restrained rather than pursued, resonated because they aligned with lived experience. This was how power had worked for generations. The idea that a phone call could alter the course of justice did not feel implausible. It felt familiar, yet familiarity did not equal proof. That gap between what people believed and what could be demonstrated defined the final state of the case. Evidence had not vanished through negligence alone. Time had erased opportunities. Witnesses had aged. Memories softened. One by one, those present in 1977 slipped beyond reach. When Jerry Gallagher died in 2023, the significance was immediate and stark. He had been the last person to see Mary alive. With his passing, the final living anchor to the critical 30 minutes was gone. From that point on, the case could move only through documents, testimony already given, and whatever remained buried, physically or institutionally. As the 50th anniversary approached, calls for an inquest grew louder again. Supporters argued that even without a criminal conviction, an inquest could establish facts, expose failures, and acknowledge harm. It would allow the state to confront its own past, not just the loss of a child, but the systems that may have prevented justice from being pursued fully. In Irish law, such an inquiry was possible. Politically, it remained fraught. The Attorney General did not act, and so the case entered its final form. Not resolved, not dormant, but suspended. Mary Boyle remained 6 years old in the public imagination, fixed in a lilac jumper, walking a short distance home. The landscape of Cashelard remained unchanged to casual observers, its hills and bogs holding their shape as they always had. But beneath that surface, the case continued to exert pressure, a reminder that some truths do not fade simply because time passes. In the end, the disappearance of Mary Boyle left no single answer. It left a series of questions about responsibility, about silence, about what justice requires when certainty is no longer possible. It asked whether closure must always come through courts, or whether acknowledgement itself carries moral weight. It asked what a state owes to a child when it cannot give her back to her family. And it left one final, unresolved measure of distance. Some cases are remembered for what they reveal. Others endure because of what they refuse to let disappear. Mary Boyle belongs to the latter. Share Mary's story. Keep it present. Ask why an inquest has never been held, and why accountability remains deferred. Public memory is not noise. It is pressure. If you want long-form investigations that center victims, expose institutional failure, and refuse to let unresolved cases fade, subscribe to this channel. New cases and deep-dive narratives are released regularly, with respect and rigor.